Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 67, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. This week is going to be a little bit of a chat. I didn't really have a topic that I felt like exploring this week, and I'm waiting to schedule a few more interviews. So we're just going to have a little visit, and I'll talk about what I've been sewing and some of my favorite sewing tools, some of my favorite podcasts, some of my favorite YouTube channels. It's just going to be kind of a potpourri. So the last week of January was very busy. I didn't do much sewing that week at all. I had a lot of meetings for some reason. They all kind of stacked up that last week. And the sewing that I did get done was to take 4 fat eighth bundles of Tim Holtz fabric out of my stash. And I've said before that I'm quite the Tim Holtz fangirl. I've got several bins full of Tim Holtz fabric, both yardage and pre-cuts. And this particular fat eighth bundle was from his correspondence line, which honestly I think came out in 2015. So I tend to let things marinate in my stash for a while. And I used the fat eighth flapjacks pattern from Fat Quarter Shop. It's a free download on their website. I found that the Tim Holtz prints tend to be on the larger side, and it's good not to chop them up too small. I made a quilt for my father-in-law out of a Tim Holtz fat quarter bundle a couple of years ago. Probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And I used a subway tile pattern. So the blocks were fairly large. I think they were 4 inches by 8 inches, and they just offset on every row. And that worked really well. The fat eighth flapjacks pattern worked really well for the fat eighth bundles. I had almost exactly enough. In fact, I ended up making the quilt a little bit bigger. I added another column of blocks. So instead of being 4 blocks wide by 8 blocks long, I made it 5 blocks wide by 8 blocks long. And I think the final size was 64 inches by 67 inches. I didn't put a border on it. The pattern calls for a border, but I liked the way that the quilt looked without a border, so I left the border off. This quilt is destined to be given to an older gentleman at our church. He has his 91st birthday this week, and I may not get it done in time for his birthday, but hopefully it will be sometime this month. He lost his wife a couple of years ago and began coming to our church, and at first he came in and would just sit in the back by himself, even though he's fairly well known in our community. And as the years have gone by, I think he's been coming for a couple of years, he's started to integrate himself into our community even more, and we all want to kind of take care of him. So I thought making him a quilt would be a nice thing to do. And he used to be a farmer. He's a retired farmer. So I got some farm themed fabric for the back of the quilt. It's red fabric with black tractors all over it. And I just thought that that would be a fun way to back the quilt. So I still have to base that one together with the backing and the batting, but I'm hoping to get it quilted before the end of February. I was hit with a wild hair about the middle of last week and decided that I couldn't do anything else until I cleaned up and straightened up my sewing area. And I had a stack of quilts that I've made, and they're quilts that I don't want to donate. They're ones that I want to keep for myself, but they were folded up and I don't want them to get damage from the fold lines. So I took the quilt off of the spare bed in the spare bedroom, which is a full-size bed, and I laid all of the quilts out open on that bed, sort of like a bed turning, if you've ever seen a bed turning where they put a stack of quilts on a bed and they take them off one by one so that you can see what's underneath. So I stacked all of the quilts on that bed and put the original quilt back on that was on it. And now nobody knows that there's half a dozen quilts stacked under there. They're pretty much hidden, and that's going to save them from getting any fold damage. But while I was doing that, I unearthed a quilt top and the fabric for a border for that quilt top. My older daughter lives in Alaska. I think I've mentioned this before. She and her husband live in Ketchikan, Alaska. He is the dentist at the Coast Guard station there, and they're actually probably going to be moving back down to the lower 48 this summer. They've been up there since March of 2021. And the first time I went to visit her after they moved up there, I popped a Janome Hello Kitty sewing machine into my carry-on case, and I took it up there and left it there so that while I was there, I would have something to do. I live in a pretty rural area, and I'm used to making my own entertainment, but Ketchikan is even more isolated than Montana. And I wanted to be able to work on some projects while I was there. So I typically take a jelly roll with me when I'm going up to visit her. And the last time I took a jelly roll, I got pulled aside by the TSA agents at the Seattle airport because they didn't know what was in my carry-on bag. And so they asked me if they could take everything out of my carry-on bag, and I said sure. And what had tripped their notice was the jelly roll that I had in my carry-on bag. So note to self, it's probably better to put the jelly roll in the suitcase rather than the carry-on bag. And that particular jelly roll happened to be from Laundry Basket Quilts, and it was their Moonstone fabric line. And I had put the jelly roll together in a jelly roll race type quilt, and I bought the fabric for the border and never put the border on. So I decided that it was time to put the border on this week. So I did that, and I measured the quilt, and I went to the quilt store where I had gotten the jelly roll, and they still had yardage. So I was able to get another print out of that line to use as the backing. And I came home and I basted the backing and the top together with some batting. And I've been quilting that over the last couple of days on my Bernina Q20. I did not start out being a Bernina fangirl. There really wasn't any reason for it. I just didn't have any need for a Bernina machine until I decided that quilting the quilts that I was making was a little bit too difficult on my Janome 6600. I had quilted several quilts on that machine, including a king-size quilt, but it was quite an undertaking, and I thought that if I were going to keep quilting, I really needed a better way to get my quilts done. I don't really have the room for a long arm on a frame, but I happen to be in the quilt store where I teach, which is a Bernina dealer, just before Christmas, about 3 or 4 years ago, and the owner had a Q20 in a horn lift table, and she gave me such a screaming deal on it that I couldn't refuse. So I bought that. That was my very special Christmas present to myself that year. And it sits here in my office. It is right in front of the window that overlooks the front yard and the road that our house sits on. So it's a very pleasant place to sit and quilt. I get to look out and see what the weather's doing. I get to watch the wildlife walking through the yard. I get to see who's driving up and down the road or walking up and down the road. So that's been a really great setup for my quilting. Rather than having to rearrange my bedroom in order to quilt a machine on the sewing machine that I keep up there, it's easier just to be able to come down to my office. The table has leaves on it that expand, so the table, when it's all the way open, is 6 feet long, and I don't have any trouble quilting a king-size quilt on there. So I've been working on that jelly roll quilt. I'm just doing loopy meanders. A loopy meander was one of the first quilting free motion quilting patterns that I learned. I'm actually pretty good at it, and so it tends to be my default free motion quilting pattern for things that I don't want to custom quilt or ruler quilt. I took a free motion quilting class from Angela Walters at the Quilting Bee in Spokane, and I think it must have been around 2018 or 2019 because my younger daughter was a senior at Gonzaga that year, and that was a phenomenal class. Angela is a fabulous teacher. I can't say enough good things about her. And that class was on variations on meandering. So a loopy meander, we also did a leaf meander, a paisley meander. I'm getting better at some of those other meandering patterns, but I'm really good at loops, so I tend to default to loops. Loops are also fast, and when I want to get a quilt quilted quickly, say that 3 times fast, when I want to quilt a quilt quickly, I use the loopy meander because it doesn't take me very long. I think it took me 2 days to quilt this jelly roll quilt, and now I'm working on the borders. And being the creature of habit that I am quilting ribbon candy in the borders because ribbon candy is probably my favorite quilting pattern for borders. I'm using the Amanda Murphy ribbon candy ruler, although she calls them templates now. I still call them rulers, and it's going very quickly, and I'm very pleased with the way it looks. So now you know that if Janet has to quilt a quilt quickly, she's going to probably quilt loops, and she's going to use ribbon candy in the border. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to do for the Tim Holtz correspondence quilt, the one that I used the Fat Eighth bundles for. I'm thinking that's going to be another variation of a loop meander, but I think I might do double loops on that one. We'll see. I haven't quite decided. The other project that I unearthed while I was busy cleaning last week was the wall hanging that I made from a kit from a class that I took at Garden of Quilts in 2021 at Thanksgiving Point, just outside of Salt Lake City. My friend Tara, who is like my sewing partner in crime, her daughter lives in Salt Lake City, so we went down there to go to Garden of Quilts, and we took that class together. And Tara is much better about finishing her projects. She got that kit from that class finished within a couple of months, I think, and it took me 3 years. But it was an English paper piecing class. And just before Christmas, I finished all of the units. I sewed them all together. I turned it into a wall hanging, and then I set it aside and didn't do anything with it. So I unearthed it, and I got a backing for it, and I basted it with some batting, and that has been quilted. I basically did stitch in the ditch quilting around each of the units, and I like the way it made them kind of 3-dimensional almost. I just need to bind that one, and then I can hang it up somewhere in my house. Honestly, I didn't think I was going to be doing this much quilting at the beginning of 2025. I came into 2025 thinking that I was going to be working on some By Annie projects. I still have everything cut out to do the Place for Everything tote and the Running with Scissors, but they've been languishing because I've been busy working on these quilts and trying to get a few things moved through the pipeline, which is fine. I answer to myself, and I'm the person that creates my schedule. So if I decide to set something aside and work on a quilt instead of a different project, then I'm the only person that I have to answer to. I also thought that I might be making a few more pieces of clothing because I've got some sweater knits that I'd really like to work with. But right after Christmas, I don't know, I was tired of making clothes. I spent most of last fall working on pants drafting and doing some other pattern drafting and pattern alterations, and I think I just needed a break from making clothes. And then there is the infamous Hobby Lobby fabric. So any of you who have been reading my blog know that last fall I bought some really pretty baby blue quilted fabric at Hobby Lobby. And I bought it and I thought, I'm going to make myself a jacket out of this. Well, here we are, probably 5 or 6 months later, and I still don't have a jacket because I can't decide which jacket I want to make. And in the meantime, I've bought probably half a dozen different jacket patterns. I think I finally settled on the Nomi 2057, and this is by Alyssa Threads. It's a really simple zip-up jacket with welt pockets, and that's pretty much what I'm looking for. I did kick around maybe making the tamarack jacket, and I've got that pattern cut out, but I think I'm going to make the Nomi jacket. The only problem is, and I didn't realize this when I bought that fabric, it doesn't have a backing fabric on it. It's the fashion fabric on the front, and on the back is a polyester batting and scrim. And if I'm going to use it in a jacket, it's going to have to be a lined jacket. So I haven't quite decided if I'm going to do a conventionally lined jacket. One of my blog readers mentioned flatlining as a possibility. So I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully I will get this done in time to wear it this spring. It has almost become a joke, and if I didn't like that fabric so much, I take it out and pet it every so often because it's really soft. If I didn't like that fabric so much, I might have donated it to somebody or done something else with it, but I really still do want to make a jacket out of it. I've also been working on my class handouts for Sew Expo, which is coming up in a couple of very short weeks. I am teaching. I had 7 classes on the schedule. One of the classes did not fill, so we decided last week to cancel that one, which leaves me with 5 knitting classes and 1 sewing class. And 3 of the 5 knitting classes are classes that I taught last year, so I already have the handouts for them. I just needed to go in and tweak them. And then I needed to create handouts for the other 2 classes, and I don't need a handout for my threads class, which is the sewing class that I'm teaching, because I already have that handout. But I don't like to leave things until the last minute. I don't know about you, but I still, at my advanced age, have nightmares about showing up for my final exams and being completely unprepared. So I've spent a couple of hours in the morning the past week or so working on those class handouts, and I hope to have them done by this weekend. And then I can start packing up all of my supplies and all of my class samples and getting everything ready. I'm going to pop back to quilting for just a second. Last month, I taught a ruler work class at the quilt store where I teach. The owner asked if I could do some ruler classes. She teaches the free motion quilting classes on the long arm machines, but we were looking for some classes for people who have the Q20, the Q series machines like I do, or other sit down machines. So I've developed a series of 4 classes, and the first one last month was on straight line quilting. So I did a sampler and showed students how to mark out a quilt if they want to do straight line quilting, so like 60-degree diamonds or a brick pattern or things like that. This month I'm doing one on using curve rulers, so we'll be using circle rulers and oval rulers and clamshell rulers and looking at the various designs that can be created with those rulers. So I'm really enjoying that class, and I think the students are too. At the end of next week, I'll be teaching the wool and wax tote, which is one of Anna Graham's designs. She sells her patterns under the Noodlehead label, and I have every single pattern that she's ever released because they are probably, bar none, the best written patterns I've ever seen in my entire life. The designs are great, but the instructions for making her bags are phenomenal. And she's recently started releasing tutorials on YouTube for some of her patterns too, so that's exciting. So we'll be doing that class at the end of next week, and I hope to introduce a few more students to the wonders of Noodlehead and Anagram's patterns. Let's switch gears here. I need to talk about the elephant in the room, which is Joann Fabrics. I think by now everybody has heard that Joann Fabrics filed for bankruptcy for the second time in a year. And I'm just not optimistic that they're going to be able to pull out of this one. I think Joann Fabrics as we know it is probably destined for the history books. I know there are some court hearings that are scheduled for this week, the week that this podcast drops. So we may know more by the end of the week, but we may not. I talked to the manager at our local store, and she seemed to think that nothing would be firmed up until the middle of March, and they wouldn't know for sure what was going to happen until about then. I have lots of thoughts about this, and I am by no means an expert. Other than my husband and I have been self-employed since we graduated from college, and I have a family history of business ownership and entrepreneurship. So I tend to look at things from a business perspective. I really think that Joann's blew it in terms of their business management. I think that they probably had a bunch of bean counters in charge who did not understand the customer base, and those corporate managers saw it as their job to compete with Michael's and Hobby Lobby rather than establishing themselves as a place where people could learn to sew and learn to make things, thus creating a customer base that would continue to buy their products. But when you fill your stores with plastic junk from China that can be bought at other big box stores, then I think you've lost the narrative. You've lost the understanding of what your customers want. I said on several occasions that I didn't know who was designing fabric for them, because especially for kids' clothing, I would go there to get cotton lycra knits to make kids' t-shirts and things like that. And kids' clothing is small, so you want small scale prints, but did they have small scale prints? No, they had these gigantic oversized scale prints that when you cut them up into a t-shirt for a 4-year-old, you couldn't see anything. I think they got a little carried away with the fleece and flannel, and maybe they just assumed that no one was making clothes for themselves anymore, and so they didn't need to carry apparel fabric, and what apparel fabric they did carry was really ugly. And the pandemic gave them a golden opportunity to train a new generation of sewists, but I think once again they probably assumed that nobody was sewing clothes, and so they didn't need to pursue that. So here we are. Our Joann's store, our local store, is looking a little picked over. The manager told me that they probably weren't getting any more shipments of patterns until they find out what's going on with this bankruptcy. I fully expect to drive by there at some point in the coming weeks and see a store closing sign or a store liquidation sign, because I just don't see how they can pull out of this. It's sad. Joann Fabrics has been around my entire life. I remember shopping there with my mother when she was making clothes for us when we were kids. And now it's going the way of Fabricland and Hancock Fabrics. And I know that there are people who will say don't shop at Joann Fabrics because the quality is not as good as what you find in an independent fabric store. And I'm sure that's true. I know it's true. But not everybody has the luxury of having an independent fabric store nearby. I find it very interesting that we have a Joann Fabrics here in Kalispell, which is, I don't know, I think we're up to about 90,000 people in the Flathead Valley. Spokane actually has 3 Joann Fabrics stores, and Coeur d'Alene, which is not that far from Spokane, has a Joann Fabrics store. But when I go to Cleveland, where my mother lives, she lives on the west side of Cleveland in a little town called Avon, there is one Joann Fabrics store about 20 minutes east of her towards Cleveland, and there is one Joann Fabrics store about 20 minutes west of her toward Lorain. And we actually had to drive to the east side of Cleveland to a fabric store in Murray Hill, which carries apparel fabric. And that was probably a 45-minute drive. And that was the closest to her that there is an independent fabric store carrying apparel fabric. A lot of quilt stores don't want to carry apparel fabric because it's a risk for them if it doesn't sell. I've been fortunate in that the quilt store where I teach, the owner is very willing to order garment fabric. She keeps a pretty reasonable stock of double brush polys and rayon batiks and some Brussels washer linen from Robert Kaufman. And I do my utmost to use those fabrics and offer classes using those fabrics so that people know that they can come there and buy apparel fabric. But a quilt store is not going to carry the variety of apparel fabric that some of us are looking for. So even Joann Fabrics, ugly apparel fabric as it was, they at least had some. Hobby Lobby is hit and miss. I've found some pretty decent fabric there, but again, a lot of their fabric is just stuff I wouldn't buy. It's not things that I would make clothing out of. So we'll have to see. I do buy fabric online, but I don't like to buy fabric online unless I am buying from a place that I've purchased from before and I know the quality and the selection are good. So I buy a lot of my knit fabric from knitfabric.com or Cali Fabrics or StyleMaker Fabrics. I've bought some from Mood. I've bought some from Minerva. We all know how much I like the Walmart Remnant Rack because they get offcuts from garment manufacturers in Los Angeles, but that's been hit or miss for us recently. Our Remnant Rack hasn't been stocked very well at all. I miss fabric.com. Oh, how I miss it. I'm hopeful that if Joann's goes under, that other manufacturers and other retailers will step into the gap, but we'll have to wait and see. So tell me what you think. What's going on in your corner of the world? I have a lot of listeners around the world. I've got several in Australia. I don't know what it's like to buy fabric where you are, so feel free to send me an email and let me know what that's like. I can only describe what it's like where I live in the Pacific Northwest. I'd like to think that people are wanting to learn how to sew. One of the things that I didn't mention yet, but I'll talk about it now, is this past Saturday, a few days ago, I taught a beginning sewing class at our community center. So my mailing address is Kalispell, Montana. I actually live about 12 or 15 miles east of Kalispell proper. We are along the foothills of the Swan Range of the Rocky Mountains, and our road is called Foothill Road because it runs along the base of that mountain range. And the area where we live was settled by newcomers to this area in the early 1900s, and it was christened Mountain Brook. So we live in the Mountain Brook community. And the people who lived here at that time, because getting to Kalispell was quite an undertaking, you had to ride your horse or drive your wagon to the river and then take a ferry across the river and then go to town and then do the whole thing in reverse. So the trip now that I make in 30 or 40 minutes used to be quite the undertaking. So the people who lived in this area learned to do for themselves. A lot of the buildings around here were built with volunteer labor and donated materials, including the Mountain Brook School, which is about 4 miles north of my house. And it was given to the Mountain Brook Homestead Foundation about 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm on the board of that foundation. And we're raising money and trying to renovate the 1927 schoolhouse. We also have to raise a fairly significant amount of money every year just to keep the lights on and the doors open on the newer building that's on that campus. And that's a library and community center. So on Saturday, I taught a beginning sewing class there. I try to do this a couple of times a year as a fundraiser. So I provide everything. I bring a couple of sewing machines. I bring my ironing board and an iron. I prepare the materials ahead of time. So the class, in the class, we make pillowcases using the burrito method. So I always have sets of fabric laid out for people to choose from. And again, everything's included in the class fee, and I donate the class fee to the Homestead Foundation as a fundraiser. So this past week, I had two 20-something young girls and an older lady who was about my age. And it was interesting to talk to the young girls because one of them came in and she said, I want to learn all of the skills. I want to learn all of the things that women used to know how to do, like sewing and canning and cooking. And I said, well, you're in the right place. And I actually do also teach a canning class during the summer. But she really wanted to learn things that she hadn't been taught in school. Like I graduated from high school in 1984 without ever having taken a home ec class, which I think is kind of criminal. And I don't think it's gender oriented necessarily. I think everybody needs to know how to do these things. We have a neighbor who has an 11-year-old boy, and he made a quilt and entered it into the fair last year as part of his 4-H project. So I think it's important for everybody to know these skills. And I do think that there is interest by young people in learning some of this stuff. Okay, I'm going to step down off my soapbox before I fall off. I think this episode has probably gotten long enough. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and wonder what I'm going to talk about for half an hour, and then I sit down in front of the microphone and look, we've spent 31 minutes chatting. As always, feedback is welcome. I have gotten some of the nicest emails and notes in the last 2 or 3 weeks, so I really appreciate every single one of you that sits down and listens to me every week. If you know somebody who might enjoy listening, by all means, please tell them. I'd love it if you left a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. My email is janet@janetzabo.com. I've gotten some really great suggestions of podcast guests. I'm reaching out to these people and trying to schedule some of them, so keep those suggestions coming. If you want to check out my blog, it's at www.janetzabo.com. There is a link to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website. The podcast website is at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com, and that's where I keep all of the show notes and other information. And with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. Until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.